On the morning of February 7th, 1890, Jeanette Sawtell walked into her husband's fruit store on the streets of Boston and found his brother standing behind the counter. Hiram had been gone for 4 days. He had taken a train to Rochester, New Hampshire, to collect their 7-year-old daughter, Marion, who had fallen ill. Or so the telegram said. He had not come back. He had not written. He had not sent word of any kind. Jeanette asked Isaac where her husband was. Isaac said he hadn't seen Hiram in Rochester. Didn't know where he was. Jeanette called him a liar. She told him to his face in the store that bore her husband's name that he had murdered Hiram. Isaac said nothing that changed her mind. She waited 2 more days. Then she went to the police. What followed would consume the next 2 years. A manhunt across 3 states, a trial on Christmas Day, a confession drawn on a hand-sketched map, a skull found in the woods of Maine, and a death in a prison cell 10 days before a scheduled execution. A death the newspapers refused to believe was natural. But it begins here, not with a body in the ground, not with detectives and telegrams and courtroom testimony. It begins with a woman who already knew the answer, standing across a counter from the man who had the only other one. The Sawtell brothers grew up in the same house, inherited the same family name, and by 1890 had lived entirely different lives. Hiram was 42. He ran a fruit store in Boston, supported a wife and daughter, and had built the kind of quiet stability that looks unremarkable from the outside and takes years to construct. He was known by the distinctive shape of his face: heavy side whiskers, clean-shaved chin, the kind of feature people remembered when asked to describe a man they had passed on a road. Isaac was older. In 1876, he was convicted of 3 counts of rape and sentenced to 30 years at the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown. He served 13. Prison officials declared him reformed. In 1889, he was pardoned and released. Hiram took him in. He offered Isaac work in the store, gave him a place to land, spoke openly about the possibility of a business partnership. Whether this came from genuine warmth or from the weight of obligation that blood imposes, the result was the same. Isaac was back inside the family, back inside the business, back inside the life his brother had built while he was gone. Then their father died. The property passed to their mother. Hiram managed it on her behalf. And in December 1889, just months after his release, Isaac went to his mother and persuaded her to sign the property over to him, behind Hiram's back. When Hiram found out, he filed a legal injunction to prevent Isaac from selling anything. The injunction held. The property stayed frozen. What the legal record cannot tell us is what happened between the brothers after that. Whether there were arguments, silences, accusations across the counter of the fruit store. What we know is that by early February 1890, the partnership Hiram had offered was gone, and Isaac had a plan. It did not start with a gun. It started with a child. On February 1st, Isaac told Jeanette that he and their mother were making a trip to Lowell, and that Hiram had given his permission for Marion to come along. Hiram had given no such permission. Jeanette was uncertain, but the arrangement had the texture of something ordinary. An uncle, a grandmother, a short journey, a child who would enjoy the company. She let Marion go. She found out about the missing permission only after they had already left Boston. They did not go to Lowell. They went to Rochester, New Hampshire. Marion was 7 years old. She spent several days in Rochester with her uncle and grandmother, while her father, 3 states away, knew nothing of where she actually was. What she saw in those days, what she was told, what she made of the adults around her, none of that was recorded. She came home healthy. The telegram had described her as sick with influenza, gravely enough that her father should come immediately. But by the time she returned to Boston on February 6th, she showed no signs of illness at all. Jeanette noticed this. It was one of the first things she noticed, before she even began to understand what it meant. The telegrams had arrived on consecutive days. The first addressed to Hiram, the second to Jeanette, both sent from Rochester, both carrying the same urgent message. They discussed what to do. If Marion was ill, one of them should go. There was no obvious reason for both. Hiram bought a ticket on the 1 o'clock train from Boston to Rochester, said what a man says before a practical trip, and left. In Rochester, his first stop was a hardware store. He purchased a pick, a shovel, and an axe. The most plausible explanation is that Isaac had suggested some work to be done. On the property, on the farm, something that required tools and hands. An errand folded into the reunion. Reasonable enough that Hiram did not question it. He rented a buggy. 2 men were seen on the road between Rochester and East Rochester, one of them recognizable by his side whiskers and clean-shaved chin. That evening, several people in the area heard 3 gunshots. The detectives who came to Rochester in the days after Hiram's disappearance worked from fragments. A blood-stained axe, wrapped in newspaper, found in the woods. A shoe identified as Hiram's. A handkerchief monogrammed with the letter S. Witnesses who placed 2 men together on the road, who identified one by his side whiskers. The hardware store clerk who remembered the pick, the shovel, the axe. The man who rented the buggy. The people who heard shots somewhere in the dark near the road after midnight. The pieces pointed to a specific location, a barn on a farm owned by a man named Jed Morrill, situated between Rochester and East Rochester, New Hampshire. This was where the state would later conclude the murder took place. Near an abandoned farmhouse not far from there, the detectives found the body. Hiram Sawtell was partially buried in the earth. He was naked except for his socks. There were 3 bullet wounds in his chest. His head and both arms had been removed with an axe. The explanation, when investigators examined the scene, was practical rather than frenzied. Whoever dug the grave had underestimated how much work it required. The hole was too shallow, too narrow. The body would not fit. So the problem was solved with the same axe Hiram had purchased at the hardware store on the day he arrived. The head and arms were not found, not then. What the newspapers noted, and what the public absorbed with a particular kind of horror, was the combination of violence and calculation the scene implied. The shooting was the act of someone who had made a decision. The dismemberment was the act of someone who, having made that decision, was still thinking clearly enough to solve logistical problems. One detail remained unresolved. The body had been found not in New Hampshire, but in the woods outside Berwick, Maine. A line on a map that no one had been paying attention to. Until now, it mattered a great deal. In 1890, New Hampshire had the death penalty. Maine did not. The body of Hiram Sawtell was found on the Maine side of the state line, in the woods outside Berwick, York County, which meant that before any trial could proceed, before any verdict could carry the weight of execution, someone had to determine where the murder actually occurred. A coroner's jury was convened in York County, Maine. They reviewed the evidence, the location of the barn on the Morill farm, the witness testimony placing the two men together in New Hampshire, the trajectory of events on the night of February 5th. Their conclusion, reached on the available circumstantial evidence, was that the murder had been committed in New Hampshire, not Maine. This was not a certainty. It was a judgment, a determination made because the evidence leaned one direction, not because anyone could draw a straight line from bullet to border. Isaac Sawtell understood this. He had been present for everything, and he was not a man who failed to notice details. Whether he chose the location of the body deliberately, whether he dragged or carried his brother's remains toward the Maine border with full knowledge of what that border meant, is a question the record cannot answer. What it can answer is what the determination cost him: a New Hampshire trial, a New Hampshire jury, and a New Hampshire judge with the authority to send him to the gallows. The line in the woods had not saved him, but he would spend the next 2 years trying to make it useful. When the Boston police came to question Isaac Sawtell, he was already gone. They traced him back to Rochester. By the time detectives arrived, he had left again. The trail went north. In Portland, Maine, the manager of a hotel had grown suspicious of a guest registered under the name J. Bridge, a man who fit the published description of Isaac Sawtell closely enough that the manager went to the police rather than simply watch him. Officers recognized the man. They arrested him aboard a train that was preparing to leave for Montreal. Isaac Sawtell had 2 tickets in his pocket. The second ticket was assumed to be for a man known as Dr. Blood. This was not his name. It was the kind of name a certain type of man acquires in prison. A confidence man from Boston who had crossed paths with Isaac Sawtell during his years at Charleston and had apparently remained in contact after Isaac's release. What they had discussed, what arrangements they had made, what Dr. Blood understood about what Isaac had done in Rochester, none of this was ever established in any courtroom. When Dr. Blood's photograph was printed in the Boston papers, a hotel keeper in Dover, New Hampshire came forward. Blood had stopped at his establishment not long before the arrest. He was carrying a package, the hotel keeper said, wrapped in newspaper. He described its dimensions. It was approximately the size of a man's head. Dr. Blood denied any connection to Isaac Sawtell. The denial was printed and, apparently, accepted. His name surfaced several more times in newspaper coverage of the case, always at the periphery, always suggestive, never resolved. The police did not call him in. He was never questioned under oath. No record survives of investigators pursuing the question of what he was carrying or where it went. The head of Hiram Sawtell was not found for nearly 2 years. When it was, in December 1891, it had been in the ground long enough to reduce to a skull. Where it was in the weeks immediately following the murder, whether it passed through Dover, whether Dr. Blood knew its nature, whether the package the hotel keeper described was what it appeared to be, the investigation did not ask. There is a version of this case in which Dr. Blood is a peripheral figure who happened to know the wrong man at the wrong time. There is another version in which he is something else entirely. The record accommodates both. It resolves neither. The trial opened on December 16, 1890, in Dover, New Hampshire. To cover every legal possibility, Isaac Sawtell was charged on 3 separate counts: the willful murder of his brother, acting as an accessory before the fact in a murder committed by unknown persons in Maine, and acting as an accessory before the fact in a murder committed by unknown persons in New Hampshire. The triple charge was architecture, not accident. Prosecutors had no intention of letting the jurisdictional question provide an exit. Between 60 and 70 witnesses appeared for the state. The case was entirely circumstantial. It was also, by most accounts, convincing. The hardware store, the buggy, the road, the barn, the 3 gunshots, the body. Each witness added a section of a chain that the defense could challenge at individual links, but could not break as a whole. The defense challenged dates and identifications. It denied that there had been any serious conflict between the brothers. The testimony it produced was weaker than what it was asked to counter. Isaac Sawtell, throughout all of it, maintained that the body found in the woods was not Hiram's, that Hiram was alive, that Hiram would come forward and clear everything up at the right moment. He had been saying versions of this since February, since the coroner's hearing in Rochester, where nearly 2,000 people tried to get inside the town hall to watch him say it. There is something in the persistence of the claim that goes beyond legal strategy. A man calculating his chances does not maintain an alibi this specific for this long when the evidence against him is this visible. Isaac Sawtell had decided, on some level, that he was not a man who killed his brother. The jury was going to have to convince him otherwise. They did not take long. The judge made an unusual decision. Rather than wait for the standard resumption of court after the holiday, he scheduled the reading of the verdict for December 25, 1890. The reasoning was practical. The jury had been sequestered since the trial began 9 days earlier. If they returned a verdict on Christmas Day, they could spend at least part of the holiday with their families. It was a small concession to ordinary life in the middle of a proceeding that had drawn observers from across the region. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty of murder in the first degree. Isaac Sawtell was sentenced to hang. The execution was set for the first Tuesday of January, 1892, more than a year away. Time enough for appeals, for legal maneuvering, for whatever remained of his options. The courtroom on Christmas Day received the verdict without, so far as the record shows, any particular surprise. The evidence had been extensive. The deliberation had been brief. The chain of witnesses and objects and geographic details that the prosecution had assembled over 9 days had held. Outside the courthouse, it was Christmas. Inside, Isaac Sawtell heard a jury tell him what Jeanette had told him 10 months earlier, across the counter of his brother's store. The appeal failed. On December 1st, 1891, with his execution 5 weeks away, Isaac Sawtell ended 2 years of denial. He confessed to shooting his brother. He had done it, but the crime, he said, had been committed in Maine, not New Hampshire. The jurisdiction was wrong. The verdict should not stand. To support the confession, he drew a map. It is worth pausing on what this required. For 2 years, Isaac Sawtell had stood in courtrooms and hearing rooms and told anyone who would listen that the body in the woods was not Hiram's, that Hiram was alive, that Hiram would come forward. The claim had survived a coroner's inquest, a criminal trial, a Christmas Day verdict, and a failed appeal. He had signed an affidavit swearing he possessed no pistol and knew nothing of his brother's death. Now he picked up a pencil and drew a map to the skull. The map was precise. It led investigators directly to the location. They found the remains on December 7th, after nearly 2 years in the ground, reduced now to bone. When they examined the skull, they found a bullet hole. This was the fourth shot. Every witness who testified to hearing gunfire on the night of February 5th had counted 3. The skull introduced a fourth that no witness had heard and no investigator had accounted for. It did not help Isaac. It added a discrepancy to a record that had no mechanism to absorb it. The confession itself collapsed under its own contradictions. Isaac had sworn in the earlier affidavit that he was not in Rochester when Hiram was killed and had no weapon. He was now swearing the opposite. The state of New Hampshire posed the obvious question: why should the second oath carry more weight than the first? Isaac had no answer that the court found sufficient. The request for a new trial was denied. What moved him to draw the map is not in the record. Perhaps he believed, even then, that locating the skull would force the jurisdictional question open again. Perhaps 2 years of denial had become a weight he could no longer carry. Perhaps something else shifted in him during those final weeks that no newspaper thought to ask about and no document preserves. What he left behind was a hand-drawn map, signed with his name, showing exactly where he had left his brother's head. Whatever calculation produced it, it changed nothing. It confirmed everything. On the evening of December 24, 1891, 10 days before his scheduled execution, Isaac Sawtell collapsed in his cell. He lost consciousness and did not regain it. The prison physicians were called. They worked through the night. The goal, as newspapers noted with a candor that was not meant to be cruel, was to preserve him for the gallows. A condemned man who dies before his execution cheats the state of its conclusion. And in a case this public, this prolonged, and this extensively covered, the state had an interest in its conclusion. Isaac Sawtell died on December 26, 1891, still unconscious. He was 61 years old. The rumor moved through Boston and the surrounding region almost immediately. He had taken opium, smuggled it into the cell somehow, chosen his own death rather than submit to one assigned to him. The story had the shape of something people wanted to believe, that a man capable of the cold planning the Sawtell case had demonstrated would not leave his ending to chance. 2 days later, an autopsy was conducted. The cause of death was apoplexy, a stroke, sudden and massive, with no evidence of any introduced substance. The physicians were unambiguous. No opium, no poison, no deliberate act. Isaac Sawtell had not managed his own exit. His body had simply failed before the state could finish what it started. The public received this information. Whether it believed it is a different matter. The rumor outlasted the autopsy. Some versions of it were still being printed as late as 1958.